Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. My name is John Zann. I work for PMA Consultants in our Michigan offices. I've been with PMA since 1995. So I've done a lot of scheduling over that time, and I've had the good fortune of using NetPoint actually since its inception. So today I'm going to talk about using NetPoint and P6 in conjunction in project controls. So first, I'll talk a little bit about why you might want to import and export between the two tools, and then we'll touch on the capabilities of what NetPoint can do, and then go over an overview of the export and import process, and then the fun stuff begins when we do the demos. I expect the demo to last about half the session, and that's kind of really the meat and potatoes, so to speak. Lastly, I'll touch extremely briefly on Project Summit and how that handles import from P6. So just from a terminology perspective, export could mean from NetPoint to P6 or the other way around. The way I'm going to use these terms today is NetPoint to P6 is an export, and P6 to NetPoint is an import. Okay, so why would you want to do this? I have three reasons here, maybe 3.5, depending on how you count the last one, that I've used throughout my career. And I'm sure others in the audience have different reasons as well, but these are kind of the three main ones that I've seen. So as we know, and as Tim did a great job of this morning, NetPoint's a very graphical tool, easy to understand, even for non-schedulers. P6, great scheduling tool, is a little more difficult to understand for non-schedulers for sure. So one of the things we run into is you might have a gigantic P6 schedule, 10,000 activities or whatever, and you want to summarize it in NetPoint because NetPoint is a little easier to understand. So you could do that totally manually, and that would be fine. But sometimes you can use an import from your P6 schedule into NetPoint to help facilitate that summarization process. It's still not automated, but it makes it a little easier. The second one's kind of the opposite of that. And Nick talked a little bit about some poll planning sessions and collaborative kind of building level one schedules type of things. So a lot of times what we do is we do have those collaborative sessions where we're building a high level schedule with the stakeholders. Everyone can see it being built, can understand the logic and that type of thing. But then we want to go into P6 for a more detailed, we'll call it a level 3 schedule. That may be because maybe the contract requires P6. Maybe you have an overall master schedule that's in P6. Maybe you just prefer P6 for the detailed tracking. But so you start in NetPoint with the collaborative session, and then you push it into P6 and can build the detail. The third reason, and this is a little bit more nuanced, but sometimes you'll want to do some what-if scenarios in a schedule, and you can certainly do that in P6, but occasionally you kind of get lost in the, in the details. So there is a way to obviously import from P6 to NetPoint, but you can also import just a portion of your activities. So say you're struggling with a certain, roofing sequencing in your project, and you're looking at it in P6 and you understand it as a scheduler, but maybe your audience doesn't. So you could import just those activities for the roofing into NetPoint, do some what if scenarios kind of in real time in an interactive fashion, see what the impacts are, decide on what type of solution or resequencing you want to do, and then you could go back into P6 and make those changes. And then I called this one kind of a half a reason because this is not really a reason in and of itself, but it's sort of a technique where you might want to do a bunch of round trips. So you might want to go from P6 to NetPoint and back throughout the life of a project and just call that a round trip. So for the first one, here's an example of a project I worked on maybe 8 or 10 years ago. It was a wind farm project. We had a moderately sized schedule, 600 activities, 1,000 logic ties. I'm just showing an excerpt of it here. And it worked out super well from a tracking perspective. It was the project controls team and actually the project team could really understand it, track, progress. It was very effective for that. But what we sort of found is when we tried to summarize this for our executive management team, it wasn't as easily understood. And we tried some things, obviously, LOEs with filters, or rolling up to activity codes or rolling up to WBS, but it just wasn't really as maybe visually friendly for our executive management team. So what we did is we took this and we imported it into NetPoint and then developed this kind of one pager executive summary. Now clearly it's not a one-for-one. You don't import it and you're ready to go, but you import pieces of it, or you import all of it and then summarize it, but it just helps in the process. And this is what we ended up with. It's 30 or so activities, and it's very easy to follow the critical path. It's quite easy to follow the logic, just more easily understood by non-schedulers and schedulers alike. So the second one we mentioned, which I said is kind of the opposite, is sit in a room, build a level 1 or level 2 schedule collaboratively with the project stakeholders, kind of interactive, real time, easy to follow. And then so here's an example of what that might look like at the end of that collaborative session. And then we took that and we exported to P6 and then built out the detail to make a level 3 schedule. In our what if analysis, so here's just a screenshot of the import process. And one nice feature, and we'll go through this in the demo in some detail, but it has these checkboxes, and so you can select which activities you want and which ones you don't want to be imported. So for example, you can see the total float column. You could sort by total float and only choose your 0 float values. So it's, like I said, it's a little more nuanced and less frequently probably done, but it does have some really good applications. The other thing I've done actually as a scheduler, you get some just really complicated logic in P6. You can trace it all day long, but until you actually see it, at least some people, it's hard to understand. So if you import that fragment into NetPoint, then you can really start to understand the logic better. So in terms of just capabilities, what NetPoint can do, you can import from obviously P6, Deltek Open Plan, Microsoft Project, XML or Excel. And if you have some other scheduling package, as long as you can get it into an Excel file or an XML, then you can import it into NetPoint. From an export perspective, it's the same packages along with Synchro, which if you haven't used, it's kind of a 4D modeling and scheduling software package. So clearly, if you're going to go between the two, you need to understand what we're calling here the fundamental differences. None of them are deal breakers, but they're important to understand, because if you get differences in your data, you might ask the question like, what's going on here? And if you understand these fundamental differences, you can either minimize them when you do this, or at least understand them. So obviously on the left here, we have GPM NetPoint, and on the right, CPM P6. The arrows are meant to indicate when you're going this direction, they're yellow, so you need to exercise some caution. So the top two are closely related. And Tim and Vivek talked about this this morning, but obviously one of the key features of NetPoint is the ability to use planned dates. And drift is really what facilitates usage of those planned dates. P6 does not allow for those. So if you have planned dates in NetPoint and you're going to P6, you need to just to comprehend that you're going to have some differences. Either your dates or your floats, there's some ways you can get around it, and we'll talk about those, but there are definitely differences. The next one is benchmark is a NetPoint only kind of activity type. Obviously in P6 you have milestones. Not a big deal, because when it comes across, it'll come across as a constrained milestone in P6, and we'll see that in the demo. Constraint types. I am a fan of judicious constraint usage in schedules in general, but obviously sometimes you do need them. NetPoint only supports 4 and P6 supports 9. So some will get transferred, some just won't come across. Just key to understand those differences if you're going from P6 to NetPoint and you have a lot of different constraint types. There are a couple related to resources. So first, this one's pretty straightforward. The P6 allows clearly resources to be applied to level of effort activities, and NetPoint does not. So if you do that and you import to NetPoint, you will lose those resource assignments. The next one is a little more subtle. So for any P6 users out there, you can obviously assign an activity as either per time unit or per duration for its resource assignments. So for example, if you have a 10-day activity and you want to assign 10 units of resources to it, you could either say per time unit, so you could say 1 per day and then you get your 10, or you could say per duration and then your total would be 10. So the behavior seems the same at first, but then clearly if the duration increases to 20, say, In the first case, you'd end up with 20 units. In the second case, you'd still have 10. So that's fine. NetPoint actually works in the same way with one difference. In NetPoint, you're allowed to make the same activity have two different behaviors for two different resources. And there are reasons where that makes sense. However, if you do that and then you export to P6, you need to kind of normalize it to match P6's criteria. And we'll see that in a minute. Activity codes has kind of a similar situation. In NetPoint, you can have a code with two values, and you can actually assign each of those values to the same activity. Clearly in P6, you can't do that. It's kind of a one-for-one. So if you have those multiple behavior codes, as we call them, when you export to P6, the codes will not come across. This is a big one, and Tim talked about this as well, but one of the key features of NetPoint is you can have multiple activities on the same row, and you can get a lot denser schedule that way. Really make things fit nicely, and you're not dealing with multiple pages necessarily. Whereas, clearly by its nature, P6 has one per row. So it's just something to be aware of, that especially if you go from P6 to NetPoint, you need to make some decisions about how you're going to place them. If you're going from NetPoint to P6, it's one per row, so there really are no decisions. And then lastly is a little bit how logic is treated. So I'll call it overlapping logic. Start to start, finish to finishes obviously are available in both, but NetPoint deals with it in a different way. There's no such thing as like a different link type. It's just you accomplish this with embedded nodes. Clearly in P6, it's a different relationship type. The other minor difference, because I'm not a fan of negative lags anyway, but NetPoint does not support those, whereas P6 does. Okay, so if you know you're going to go back and forth between the two with frequency, or really at all, as long as you have so-called control of both schedules, then you can really limit the compatibilities, or sorry, the incompatibilities. So for example, in the wind farm, our project controls team was handling both schedules. So we were able to minimize, in fact, pretty much eliminate incompatibilities. And you can't always do that clearly if, say, you are reviewing a contractor schedule and you bring it in and you do your review, and then you want to import it into NetPoint. You have no control over the contractor schedule and their usage of certain things. So as long as you have control, you can limit. And if you don't care about limiting, as long as you understand, it works out pretty well. None of them are deal breakers. Okay, so here's some screenshots of the export process. We will briefly overview this. So step one, you need to prepare your NetPoint file or accept the differences. And that's really talking about those planned dates. You can apply a start no earlier than constraint if you want to keep the dates the same. Step two is choosing the version of XCR for the export. And then calendars. Calendars have to be exported, but you need to choose if you want them global or project within P6. I generally recommend project calendars when you're coming from NetPoint, so as not to convolute your global calendar dictionary within P6, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. There are two default calendars in NetPoint, calendar days in the United States. So those are going to export no matter what. If you create a bunch of custom calendars in NetPoint and then don't assign them to activities yet, and there are reasons why you might do that. Maybe it's easier to define them in NetPoint and you're going to put them in P6 and assign them. Those actually won't come across. So just be aware, if you want a calendar to come across, make sure it's assigned to an activity before you do your export. And you can choose if you want to export your codes as activity codes. Obviously, most of the time, I think people would, and I do that pretty much every time. And the item under 4 there is just saying, again, if you have the multiple behavior, it won't come across. Then you can choose if you want to export the resources, and like we talked about, you have to pick how to handle mixed assignments. Then you define your working hours. 3 choices, 8, 10, or custom. Obviously, 8's pretty heavily used, but if you want 10-hour days or custom work hours, you can do that as well. Just for info, there are 29 fields of data that are exported when you go from NetPoint to P6. And then, as I mentioned, the formatting process in P6 is pretty simple. You can obviously make your custom layouts, grouping, sorting, filters, all that stuff, just like you would with any other P6 schedule. Okay, so importing. First, make sure you prepare the file in P6. Make sure you schedule it. If you don't, you could have some inconsistencies with the data. So there's a setting in P6 about how you're deciding which calendar is used for relationship lag. If you have mixed calendars, you can, the predecessor could be how the lag is determined, or the successor. So that's something you want to take a look at and make sure it's what you want it to be. Next, probably the most important thing is that activity types. So resource dependent activities in P6 do not come across into NetPoint. They just won't show up. So that's obviously a super important one. What I always do is I just double check, I group my P6 file by activity type. If I do have resource dependent activities, then I'll just display a column for activity type and then kind of change it to task dependent and fill down until you make sure you don't have any resource dependent activities. Then you export to an XCR just like you would any other file from P6. And then you go into NetPoint and you import that same XCR file. If for some reason you have multiple projects in the same XCR, you can only bring in one at a time. You need to pick which one you want. And then, as I mentioned in that kind of what if scenario, you can deselect activities you don't want to bring in. I generally bring everything in at first, kind of see how it looks, and then maybe I start to focus in on what I want to bring in. So NetPoint does a very neat thing where it gives you an import report, and it actually forces you to look at it. It doesn't just run in the background. You have to at least review it, or it shows up in front of your face. You need to click continue or finalize import. But what it does is it shows you so-called incompatibilities, and there are two types or categories. One is just called info, which means it's a minor incompatibility, and then a warning, which sounds kind of ominous. It's really not that bad though. It's a major incompatibility. And if you have a lot of notifications, it might make sense to export it to Excel, and you can, really use it or view it a lot more easily. And then step 5 kind of is obvious, but you need to review the formatting in NetPoint, and we'll show a couple of examples of how that looks. And then lastly, just for info, there are 33 fields of data that go in that direction, which makes me wonder which 4 are not going over when you export, but I don't know. Okay, so for our demo, here's the sample schedule we're going to use. It's a super simple, I'm calling it a sample building schedule, just kind of to orient everybody to it. Starting from the top left here, we have a data date of March 21st. One thing to note is NetPoint, the data date effectively means the end of the day. So say 5 p.m. on the 21st. In P6, although you can change it, but the default is the beginning of the day. So say 8 a.m. So what we're going to see is when we export this file into P6, the data date is going to move by 1 day. Next, the project kicks off with this benchmark activity for the NTP. And then we've got these blue activities across the top, which are kind of pseudo manual hammock activities. And you'll see in a little while why I have these in here. Each activity has start and finish date, duration in blue. The duration, in this case, these are all 7-day work weeks, so 61 days or effectively 2 months. And then below each activity, I'm showing drift, float, and total float. So total float, as they talked about this morning, is just the addition of drift and float. Excuse me. So the first phase, the project initiation phase, a couple of months, and then down here are the details. We're just validating some assumptions in design procurement. Next, we have a 4-month design phase. We're doing, unsurprisingly, design in that phase. So we have schematic design, design development, and construction documents. Additionally, we're doing some CM procurement, and then early release of a bid package and buyout for the subcontractor so we can start construction prior or a little early. And we have an 11-month construction phase here. Earthwork, basement walls, superstructure, exterior building skin and roof. And then we have this building enclosed milestone, which is showing February 28th. Then we've got our rough-in and our finishes, site restoration and landscaping. substantial completion, and then a 2-month kind of movement and closeout phase, final completion, and then a project complete benchmark. So we'll talk in some detail about the site restoration and landscaping activity. That's kind of the guinea pig that we're going to use throughout the demo. But I guess just take note, please, that it is scheduled for May 1st, basically for the month of May. It has 61 days of drift, 92 days of float, and 153 days of total float. So what that instantly tells you is that it's on planned dates. Lastly, on this screen, we have a resource profile at the bottom. So I've loaded these effectively with, dummy dollars, and then we're displaying the monthly expected spend in this histogram, and then the blue line is clearly showing cumulative. You'll note I don't have the rulers here. That you can display the rulers that show you, kind of the y-axis, the values of the y-axis, but I'm not showing them here. Okay, and we'll jump into NetPoint quickly. So a couple things that I can show you here. One is the activity IDs. So in NetPoint, you can see this ID, you can fill it in, but it also stores the system ID, which somehow the NetPoint algorithm uses in the background. But for this one, for example, I've assigned it of 1010, and you'll see that on the export. And I think one other one, I think CD maybe has, yeah, it's 1,000. Every other one is just blank. Also, you can see if I move this activity, I guess a couple things. You can see the resource profile changing down below, kind of dynamically. So if you're doing what if scenarios, oops, sorry. If you're doing what if scenarios, you can kind of see, how resources are changing. And you can also see, these are the gaps, the link gaps. So this is 85, this is 68. And so right now I have a drift of 85, a float of 68, a total float of 153. The total flow is not going to change when I make these movements. But I'll put it back to where it was. So when we do our export, you can kind of see how it works out. In terms of codes, so you can have a WBS, obviously in NetPoint, and that will export. I don't have WBS assigned here for simplicity. I do have a couple of codes though. The first is called MPT phase for NetPoint phase. You can see it's called single behavior, and the values PIP, design, construction, and closeout. So if you click on one PIP, you can see that these 4 activities in the project initiation phase are coded as PIP. Similarly for design, construction, and closeout. The multiple code has a value, this is a dummy code, but the value of 01 is assigned to building and closed, and it's also assigned, 02 is assigned to building and closed. So that's a behavior, clearly that's not going to go across. Now, if you wanted to, you can change the behavior, but only if you unassign the activities first. So you have to unassign, make it single, and then obviously follow the single behavior approach. Okay, and if we select this activity, you can see it is assigned construction. It's not assigned a multiple code, and it's assigned 10 units per duration. So this is how you change that. You can make it per day or per duration. This is per duration. Incidentally, I don't have any mixed resource assignments in here. Everything is per duration. Okay, so if we wanted to export this into P6, file, export to P6, and this window pops up. So first is the P6 project ID. This will also be the name it gives the XER file unless you choose to change it. So this is fine, sample 512.22. You have to choose the XER version. 8.3 is old, obviously, but that'll work out just fine. You can choose whether or not to create calendars as global. I'll keep them as project. Choose if you want to export your activity codes like we talked about. This tooltip is helpful. It just tells you about the behavior, multiple behavior. And then the export, I'm going to convert mixed assignments to per activity. You have to choose this or convert all assignments, even though I don't have mixed assignments, so it's not really going to matter. 8 working hours per day is fine. Let's say next. This gives you a little bit of data, not particularly useful. Okay, so I'm going to export this, and you can see the name of the XER file is the same thing as the P6 ID, which is fine. I will save it. Quick process. Let me jump over to our friendly P6. Okay, so in here then, you clearly just do an import. And for those that have used P6, it's the same process you'd use for anything. I will find it there. Okay, I'm going to point it into this same EPS node here. Sometimes it's good practice to modify your import settings. This is not really specific to coming from NetPoint at all. But if you have calendars with similar names, or sorry, with the same names in your in their global, maybe you want to say insert new instead of update existing or keep existing. It doesn't matter in this case because that's not happening. Same thing can happen with resources, but I'll say okay. Next, and then finish. Okay, so you can see our sample is here. Let me just make sure it's the only open project. There we go. Oh, one thing I'll point out, it's kind of interesting. So that text box I had naming our NetPoint file of sample building schedule actually shows up as a notebook topic in P6 here. It doesn't go back the other way, but it does put that here, which can sometimes be useful. Okay, so if we look at our activities, again, starting from left, what you'll see here, the activity IDs. So anything that is prefaced with the tilde has come, was unassigned an ID within NetPoint. So for example, project complete becomes tilde A1000, and then it auto increments +10. You can see the two that we talked about, the 1000 and the 1010, are the two activities that I had already pre-assigned. Other items of note, this was a benchmark in NetPoint. It's clearly a milestone now, and you'll see down here it's got a mandatory start constraint. So that is our benchmark becoming a constraint milestone. Our activity names all came across fine, no issue there. Duration, same thing. If you were to check those one for one, those are all matching. Dates actually at this point, they do match as well because we haven't done any calcs yet in P6. All it's doing is basically pushing the data into the fields. And you can tell we haven't done any calcs because there are no total floats shown. So if you look at our 1010 activity, it's in May. So that matches for now. It also has an at completion total cost of 10, which is what we had in NetPoint as well. So I think it's good practice in general to always do this. Whenever I get a new XER, I set a baseline and save a copy of itself. Because sometimes you can get some inconsistencies. Maybe a contractor sends you an XER and a PDF of a schedule. You bring it in, you schedule it, and all of a sudden it doesn't match the PDF anymore. And it can be because of global calendars is one of the reasons. This is a good way to check that and just see if anything has changed when you schedule it. Now, in this case, I know things are going to change because of the planned dates. Okay, so we have a baseline assigned. For the non-P6 users out there, the baseline in this case are represented by the little yellow bars. Next, we'll schedule it. You'll see the data date's March 22nd, so it's flipped forward a day. This is that calendar for scheduling relationship lag setting that I was talking about, that in some cases you just need to be aware of. Okay, we'll go ahead and schedule it. And instantly, a couple things happen. We have float values, we have red for critical, and we have some activities that you can see based on the baseline have shifted. One of which is activity 1010, site restoration landscaping, is now in March, which is consistent with our expectation. If you understand initially that it was on a planned date, you could pretty easily tell that it was going to go back to March 1st. Now, we could have applied a constraint on it in NetPoint before we scheduled, but what will happen then is that float is going to be no longer 153. So you're really choosing, do you want your total float to match, or do you want your dates to match if you use planned dates? The other two activities up here, CM procurement and design bid package release and subcontractor buyout, were also on early dates, so you see those have changed as well. If we look at our activity codes, you can see our NetPoint phase, that's our only code. So the multiple behavior code clearly didn't come across. NetPoint really only has values. Obviously P6 has descriptions as well. So it's just using the value becomes the description, so they're the same. So if we look at our site restoration activity and we look at our codes, you'll see it's assigned to construction for the phase, which makes sense. And in fact, we could group this by NetPoint phase. And then you start to see something that, you know, makes a little sense in terms of the way it's laid out. You could also, and this is, you could collapse all, and then you're effectively, with one exception, but effectively matching the blue bars on NetPoint. Okay, so that in a whirlwind amount of time is how you get from NetPoint to P6. Now we'll go in the other direction, and we're going to do this twice. The first way we're going to do it is to use the same schedule. But instead of just re-importing the same XER that I exported from NetPoint, we're going to export this as an XER and then import that in NetPoint, because that's a true round trip. So we say file export. I'm going to suffix this with an I just so I can differentiate between them. Okay, so that's pretty simple. Now this is important, becomes obvious, but when you import into NetPoint, it doesn't matter what's open. It's going to open a new schedule for you, and it's going to set the kind of the start and the finish dates of the calendar to match. So you might think I imported, it's going to muddy up the waters with the schedule, overwrite it, whatever. That's not the case at all. So if we say file, import from P6, and then we'll grab that XER file. Here are our choices, and we'll use this in a minute, but not for this one. And then we say import. Okay, so it's going to immediately pop up. You can see it in the background. I'll blow it up in a minute, but the schedule's in the background, but it gives you this import report. So over here, we have a warning, and it's saying conversion to benchmark. And if you read this, what it's saying is we have a constrained milestone. We're going to turn that into a benchmark. So actually, that's helpful. I don't consider that a warning. Info, the date adjusted, the data date has gone back to March 21st is what that's telling us. So if you saw some like really problems here, you could cancel the import, go into P6 and fix them, re-export the XER, and then re-import the XER into NetPoint. In this case, clearly I'm just going to finalize. And I'll blow this up a little bit so we can see it. So if you compare what we started with to what we have, it's, you know, 80% there, maybe 90. It's close. There are some differences, and we'll touch on those. So the first thing I see is it puts the project start and the project complete tag on there, or flag, I guess, and then it also puts the holiday line. I'm extremely finicky in many ways, but certainly in this ways, I always get rid of those three things. And then the other thing I don't like is the way it's kind of crunched this. So very simply, just push the calendar date out a month. Okay, so that starts to look a little better. Our data date, I'll drag this down just so you can see it. So that's back to March 21st. The other thing you'll see, just from a kind of scheduling perspective, a non-graphical perspective, is site restoration is back to its early dates. And that kind of makes sense because we came from P6 where it went to early. So we'll slide that back for fun to May 1st. And you can see it's got 6192 for 153, so that hasn't changed. From a graphics perspective, some of the links maybe aren't as good as they were in terms of the geometry. So in NetPoint terminology, this link is a VHV for vertical, horizontal, vertical. I think it's cleaner to make this an HV. This is just an example of a little tweak. So there we have an HV. Maybe it looks better. This is really more of a problem here because this link is going right through our CD activity now. And you could, there are a couple things you could do. I might use a VDV, so vertical, diagonal, vertical. It does still go through the activity, but at least it isn't like totally hidden by the activity. The other thing you'll see is obviously there's some text clashing. I've also, sorry, there's also some clashing here on these embedded nodes. So this is showing the lag and the date. I don't really care about that in this case, maybe, and that's doing that for 3 different times. So just an example of a cleanup is you can select all, set properties for selected objects, go over to embed, make these boxes blank. And then it's just a way to kind of globally get rid of, for all three embeds now, we have no dates or offsets. Sorry, lags. The other thing, and this was demoed earlier, but the gem mode, you can get rid of some of your text clashing. So there's clearly some here. Maybe I'll slide that over. Pyramid SD maybe needs a little more room. That's a way to sort of do things kind of globally. So you just click it once, make all your changes, or you can do it individually. Individually clearly slower. Let me do one other thing. So these dates down here, this 11/30, that's actually the finish date. The start date's not shown. And the start date's not shown because in our original file, the start date is hidden. That's actually the finish date of the predecessor. So it remembers that, but I don't like the way it's right there because you can't really tell what's going on. So I might, in that case, slide that over. The other thing I should point out is that, oops, sorry, it stacked the activity descriptions like they were before, which is super handy. So normally this would come over as one line and it would be really long, it would overwrite a bunch of stuff, but this leaves it stacked the way I had it. The last thing on the dates here is that there's this really cool feature called custom position keeping dates symmetric. So in this case, I'm displaying a start and a finish. It's clearly not good the way it is. But if you use this feature, you grab the finish and it puts the start symmetric to the finish. So I find a spot I like, put it there at the start, automatically pushes over and then say save modified position. So that's cool, that looks good. The last thing is you can see these links here. And what I realize is that this link is redundant because it's going from site landscaping to substantial completion to move in. It's also going from site restoration landscaping to move in. So redundant links aren't inherently evil, but in NetPoint sometimes you would want to get rid of those. So in this case, if you click on it, it says redundant, I say okay, and then I get rid of it. Oh, last thing on this, if we go and display our resources, you can see our resources are loaded as they were before. Okay, so that is a round trip. And I think graphically it does a fantastic job, right? I made some tweaks. There's probably still some tweaks I would make, but in general, it looks good. But what I wanted to show you is what happens. So I have pre-built the schedule. It's the same schedule, but this time it was built in P6 and it's not from NetPoint first. So it's a subtle difference, but when you go round trip like that, it remembers some of the properties. It puts them on, well, I don't even know if I said that. It put them on the exact same grid lines as they were before, which is huge. It knew where to put them based on where they came from. So super handy. You don't have that luxury if you're going from a schedule generated in P6 straight into NetPoint because it never came from NetPoint to begin with. So what I'm going to do is this is built in P6. You can kind of tell the activity IDs don't have tildes. But it's the same info. So I'm going to export this as an XCR and then we can quickly look at that. We're going to give this another eye so that we know which one to grab. Okay, so then we pop back into NetPoint, say file, import from P6. We'll grab the latest. This time I'm going to just to show you how it works, get rid of these, what were blue activities, these top four. So if you can sort this by activity name, and I know it's construction phase, design phase, moving and closeout phase, and what am I missing? Oh, PIP, project initiation phase. You can also use this up here and type, and it'll filter out for what words you type. Okay, so I'll say import. I'm going to finalize. You can see what it looks like initially. It's going to get better than that. You can say finalize import. And then you can kind of see, let me blow that up a little. You can kind of see what that looks like. So Vivek and or Tim, I think right after this session, or maybe, yeah, I think right after this session are going to have an advanced training where they talk. One of the things they're going to talk about is this layout manager. Super, super handy. They know way more about it than I do. But the layout manager is something that is meant to automate some of this. So I'm going to run it here. And what it is trying to do is optimize the layout. Okay, so it looks better. It's obviously not as good as where we're at, but it's workable. It's trying to put the kind of low float chain together, and then it's got the activities with float. But the dates are the same. If you were to check these one for one, they're the same. We're on early dates now, clearly because we came from P6. One cool thing I'll show you in the layout manager is this. It gives you a layout score, and Vivek, I'm sure we'll go into a lot more detail about this, but essentially the lower the number, the better the algorithm deems the layout. So this is a 340, that's pretty good. But if you go back and look at this one, which is the round trip one, and if you go to layout manager, say new layout, so it's a 149, so it's getting better. And then if you go to our original one, it's a 132. So it's, and I actually, if I had some spare time, I'd like to figure out how to get that even lower. But it's a little bit of a black box to me, but it's interesting in that it does give you a score for your layout. Okay, so that is essentially it for P6 to NetPoint. I have not looked at the chat at all. There may be some questions, there may not be, but before I look at those, what I will do here is see if I can find Project Summit. So Sevi is going to have a fantastic presentation tomorrow that goes into a lot of detail about Summit and all of its kind of features. I'm only going to show you just one in comparison to what we just did. And when we talked about kind of the 3 reasons why you might want to go from P6 to NetPoint or the other way around, I think Summit will be a little bit more prepared to handle larger schedules. So like for that first option where you're summarizing large P6 schedules, I think Summit is exciting in the way it's going to handle that. But let me just show you what it does for one schedule, the same one we just did. So this is the XER file that started out in P6, and then we just put it into NetPoint and you saw what it looked like. Pretty good, but it could use some work. If you do that same import, it's super fast, although you don't really notice it. It's only 26 objects, but even with big files, it's super fast. And then if we say zoom to fit, okay, so what you can see is it's effectively, I don't know how it works, but it does a really good job because it's kind of mimicked the original layout I had, where it's got what I had as blue bars, but the phase activities along the top. And then it's got our kind of critical path here. And you can see it's even like stacked the text. So site restoration landscaping looks nice. The dates are obviously early dates because it's coming from P6. But I think it does a really good job, and I'm excited to see how this works on large schedules as well. But I was super impressed. Okay, let's see. I am looking through chat here. First question is, P6 has more constraints than NetPoint. Have I ever had an experience where I've been unable to accomplish your intended schedule model without those omitted constraint types? No, I personally haven't. You can certainly, one of them that is late as planned, for example, and for those that use P6 is not available in NetPoint, but it's effectively subsumed by planned dates. So there's an example where, once are comfortable with NetPoint, you can make those constraints that you want kind of work out for you. Is there an activity limit for P6 activities into NetPoint? I don't think there's a technical limit, but there's kind of a practical limit, because if you get too many, it can be a little bit complicated. I think I heard him say this morning that maybe up to 300 is a sweet spot. I've done one with 650. It was pretty big schedule, and it took some kind of some sort of navigation to get around from one part to another. I think more practically speaking, though, 100, 150, something like that. Have I seen improvements in project outcomes, delivering projects in time and budget using NetPoint and P6 import export? Yeah, it's a great question. I guess it's a little hard to say for sure that improvements would be attributable directly to using P6 and NetPoint together. But what I will say is when we use NetPoint for summary and P6 for detail, we've had really good success. Do I find it easier to as-built delays and changes in NetPoint versus P6? Absolutely. Yeah, PMA as a firm does a fair amount of kind of claims analysis, time impact analysis, delay analysis, those types of things. And we 100% of the time, as far as I know, are using NetPoint to demonstrate. Now, sometimes P6 will do some of the calcs and NetPoint will do some, but from a demonstration perspective, yes, NetPoint is really good for that. Will they readily export to P6 if there's no activity ID number? Yes, yeah, everything will go across. They'll just assign you an ID number if there isn't one already assigned. How often on my assignments do I use both NetPoint and P6 like I demonstrated today? Another, yeah, good question. I'd say in some fashion, at least half the time. It depends though on what we're doing. But yeah, it frequently, for sure. Is there a limit on the number of baselines? So I expect that's talking about our NetPoint baselines, because obviously in P6 you can have quite a stack of them. I don't actually know. Tim or someone from the development team can get back to you on that, but I don't know that. I don't know the answer.
Okay, I think that's all we have for questions, John.
Awesome. Thanks everyone so much. Really appreciate it. And please don't miss the 9 a.m. or the 10 a.m. tomorrow. Well, don't miss any of them, but those two in particular are definitely worth watching 100%.